From the day construction began on the hospital, Selvum ceased to belong to us. During the preparations, while the site was bought and cleared, and a contractor engaged to find men and material, he spent his time with Kenny, and what they discussed I do not know, but sometimes he came home elated, and sometimes he was morose and dejected, and it was clear enough that the many delays they encountered irked his spirit beyond the telling. Then, when construction actually started, the bricks stacked high, the cement in heaps, whatever time he could spare, he spent at the site watching while brick was laid on brick and mortar flowed between. And occasionally, when the laborers let him, which was not often, for they were a jealous crew, he would take a hand in the building himself, for nothing gave him more pleasure than that. What he did not know was that 7 more tedious years were to pass before the building was complete. Both he and Kenny, possessed by their fierce enthusiasm, had, I think, reckoned on a much shorter time. Maybe it was as well they did not know. 7 years is a long time to be patient. If things had gone as they had hoped, the hospital would have been completed within a year. An old granny would not have had to die in the street as she did. There was nowhere else she could go. She had lived in the street and she died there. Day by day, she sat beside her torn gunny sack, selling handfuls of nuts and berries, growing progressively older, more ragged, less healthy. She had no relatives left, no person on whom she had any claim. Certainly, there was no one to inquire whether she made a living or how much longer she could continue to do so. Better to avoid such questions, better to pass quickly by with a cheerful word than to stop and ask, for who would lightly take on the burden of feeding another mouth? And so one day she quietly disappeared. They found her body on the path that led to the well, an empty mud pot beside her, and the gunny sacking tied around her waist. She had died of starvation. Once a human being is dead, there are people enough to provide the last decencies. Perhaps it is so because only then can there be no question of further or recurring assistance being sought. Death, after all, is final. I could not avoid the thought which came from my own uneasy conscience, harsh and bitter, as I watched them lift her up, light as dust, on to the bier, as mourners came with flowers, as oil and camphor were laid unstinted on the pyre, as rose water and sandalwood paste were sprinkled on her corpse. So it had been with my sons, so it was now with old Granny. One day it might be the same for me, for all of us. A man might drift to his death before his time unnoticed, but when he was dead and beyond any care, then, at last, he was sure of attention. Old Granny's death bore especially hard on me, for apart from the fact that we had been friends since my marriage, I could not forgive myself for having accepted the rupee which might have fed her for several days. I wanted to throw it away, give it to the next old crone I saw, anything to gain my relief. But the money belonged to Sacrabani, not to me. You are being very childish, Nathan said. How long would a rupee have kept her? A few days at least, I said. And what when those few days ran out? I don't know. Something may have turned up. It is a pity the hospital was not ready. She could have gone there. A hospital is not a soup kitchen, he said. I did not know what he meant by a soup kitchen, and I stared at him. He repeated the words, pleased that he knew and I did not. Where the poor are fed free of charge, he explained. In other countries, Selvum tells me, this is a fact. How should he know? Has he not been out of this town since his birth? From books he's read, perhaps, or Kenny may have told him. I do not know how he knows. Well, anyway, I said, going back to what we had been discussing, soup kitchen or not, they would not have refused an old ailing woman. Why go on about it? he said, exasperated. You are only distressing yourself, and it might never have been. I tell you, a hospital is only for the sick. There is nowhere for the old. The hospital was more than a few months old and a few feet high when people began attempting to stake their claims. They went to Kenny and they came to Selvum, and they even approached me, his mother. From the numbers who came, I soon knew that not 1/10 could enter, and what I of little perception knew Kenny and Selvum knew twofold. But we none of us said anything, for we had woven about us a net of silence in whose meshes were precariously held our fears and our misgivings. Meanwhile, work on the hospital did not progress smoothly. Twice the contractor was changed, and each man in turn appointed new foremen, and these brought their own laborers. One year there were not enough men, the next, not enough material. During one very hot summer, the workmen's huts caught fire, and before it could be put out, it had spread to the timber stacked nearby. The loss had to be made good, as he had also as had also the theft, despite the presence of a chowkidar, of a cartload of bricks and the cart itself. Several times work stopped altogether, for what reason I do not know, while Kenny and Selvum strode about the deserted site in exasperation. Dark as thunder, unapproachable, Kenny made frequent trips away from the town, from which he came back tired and often dispirited, but always work was resumed on his return.